dominating the other.
And that's what I'm scared about. Joshua, we've got to go on break for 2.5 minutes. I'm going to put you on hold. We'll be back, and then we'll talk more about aliens and bases. I got one more thing I want to talk to you about North Carolina about. We'll be back in 2 minutes. You're listening to Joshura P. Warren. You're listening to me, Gary, on Night Dreams Talk Radio After Dark. We'll be right back.
I gaze upon the annals of time, one thing that comes through: we are not alone in this universe. It's a thought that rings true. Ancient cave dwellers drew spacecraft on the walls. It's a recurring theme. I've seen the same thing while walking late at night, and I know it's not a dream.
From Maelstrom to Manhattan, Boston to LA, there are people asking questions and they will not go away. But what has been seen might not be what it seems. The government's shadows dance in the sea.
Coming to you from some far point station, like a cosmic tumbleweed, both north and south of the Pleiades. Here's your host, Gary Anderson.
Just wanted to make sure that last thunderstorm was over with. We got Joshura P. Warren. We're talking about aliens, Area 51, underground bases, and all that stuff. Joshua, one thing, too, that Mary said the last time I talked to her about a month ago, she said that that one underground base was expanding drastically. Have you heard anything about that in North Carolina?
You know, because that I was born and raised in Western North Carolina, and I have the museum and the haunted Asheville ghost tours and the lab and all that stuff. And I know a lot of people in Western North Carolina. I've got pretty good tabs on what's happening there, and nobody has given me any credible evidence that any of that is happening right now. And so I'm not saying that it's not. But I would be really surprised if there is some kind of a massive operation on that scale that's happening, and that I nor any of my colleagues or associates actually know anything about it that again, is compelling and logical. Now, I will tell you that if you are at Brown Mountain, and going back to Brown Mountain, and again, we can talk about that whole area because, you know, I have traveled all around and camped at Highlands and Cashiers, and I know, of course, they have the observatory there, and there are a number of things that they have there. There are weird occasions when once in a while, and this actually happened when we were filming a program for the National Geographic Channel called Paranatural, and heck, this was even 10 years ago. We were at Wiseman's View at Brown Mountain, and which is a very remote overlook, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, this truck showed up, a white SUV with a big emblem on the side that said Commonwealth of Kentucky, and there were these two odd-looking fellows inside, and they just snapped a bunch of pictures and then tore off into the distance. And we were all like, what was that about? And what does the Commonwealth of Kentucky have to do with North Carolina? And then we started to think, and we said, oh, you know what? Kentucky is where we have the Mammoth Cave system, and I think it's pretty well known that in Kentucky the government has commandeered some of that cave system in order to create underground facilities and supply storage units and factories and whatnot. And I even have a friend I've known for years whose husband is a truck driver, and he has been a part of a whole, group, a caravan of these 18-wheelers that just drives food 24 hours a day, food and water and medicine and other supplies into some of those caves around Kentucky and the surrounding states. And sometimes they get a contract to do that for a month or two at a time every year. And so I think that it's certainly possible that Western North Carolina is being considered for that. But here's what you also have to think about realistically. Yes, there are caves in North Carolina, but they are not very stable. North Carolina is a relatively large state, and yet there is only one single show cave, as they call it, in the entire state of North Carolina. And now what I'm talking about is a tourist attraction. So in the whole state of North Carolina, there's one cave that you can go to as a tourist attraction. It's called the Linville Caverns, and it's not even that big. So the caves around West North Carolina, I believe, are, they're not very stable, and I don't think they're as impressive as you'd want for a major underground operation. Now, you go to Tennessee, that's a different story. Western North Carolina is just right there next to East Tennessee. You go over to East Tennessee, you have some really big, impressive caves. And so I think East Tennessee is a much more likely candidate. Not to say that government officials haven't been snooping around Brown Mountain for a long time, but I don't think it's to build some kind of a big, NATO facility.
Interesting. So what do you think the government stockpiling all these foods and medicines and all that? I had, a truck driver on my show, about almost a year ago now, and I remember he went to one of these underground bases and he backed the rig up in, and the next thing he said, it was all these military police surrounded the vehicle. He was told to put his hands on the steering wheel and look forward, and if he turned his head, they said they would shoot him, and they made that a point. So after he did that last load with them, or his first and last load with them, he went back to his boss and said, I quit.
Yeah. Well, so, the thing is, and I also, I've doing the stuff I've done in Western North Carolina, I've been pulled over many times for no reason, and you just sit there for a while, and then finally whoever pulls you over comes back and says, oh, okay, well, your vehicle just matched the description of another vehicle, have a nice day sort of thing. And that also happened to me in Roswell. Got pulled over, not just me, but the whole crew I was with, and detained for, I'd say, 20 or more minutes without explanation. So those things happen, but now when you're talking about something more extreme, like this fella, for example, I think that basically, the government is not very well organized in most cases. Again, this is not World War II where we were pulling off against all odds D-Day or the Manhattan Project. Those days are gone. Nowadays, the compartmentalization has become ridiculous. It's almost like things are so fragmented that it's very, very difficult for there to be one singular major project that just doesn't leak out. And it's one thing to leak something; it's another thing to leak it on the internet, where it's out there and it's instantly out there. So that said, I believe that there are people who are in positions of, it's easy to say power, and look, is there possibly a shadow government? Well, why not? It would make sense to think that in a worst-case scenario, you'd have some people who would be stepping into place who knew what to do, who also were not being targeted because nobody knows who they are. And so in that case, it would make sense that there would be some echelon of individuals who have realized, like, look, at some point, something bad is going to happen. Now, what it's going to be, take your pick. It could be a major attack from another country. It could be an epidemic. I think that's very, very likely that it'll be an epidemic. We're way overdue now, or at least overdue. Look what happened in 1918. It could be a solar flare. Could be an asteroid. I mean, that's less likely. But you have these lists of things, and it's like, look, one of these things is going to happen, and your best bet is to have an underground infrastructure, and it's as simple as that. As simple as that.
Oh yeah, that's the scary part. I mean, yeah, and you know, you mentioned solar flare, and that is a pet peeve with me, because the wall, all the money it's being dumped in that, we could fix our grid system. And that is the number one thing, because seriously, how long do you think it would take for our society to break down if you flip the light switch and you had no power, you have no internet, your cell phone doesn't work, you can't get money from the bank, you can't buy anything, the food isn't coming into the stores, you go to start your car, it don't start. What's going to happen very shortly?
Well, for the past 20 years, a really good friend of mine has been Dr. William R. Forstchen. Dr. Bill Forstchen. And he has become a famous proponent of this idea of protecting the grid, because he wrote a book about this called 1 Second After. And I met Bill because he moved from New Jersey to Western North Carolina. And he used Black Mountain, North Carolina as the setting for his book, in which he does just a hair-raising, bone-chilling job of vividly describing these types of details. Here's what realistically would happen if there were an EMP, and next thing you know, you got the looting kicking in. When people get desperate, people are running out of medicine. All of a sudden, the only currency that matters is bullets. And he does such a vivid job of describing this. The book became a New York Times bestseller. Even has a sequel, and he's been on a lot of radio programs talking about this, and he even went before Congress and was able to give a formal presentation to Congress. He actually has co-authored some books with Newt Gingrich, so he has an easy way to get his foot in the door when it comes to that. And so I'm very well aware of all that, not to mention the fact that I personally experiment with EMPs all the time. Just today, I actually was in my laboratory in Las Vegas, and I was producing EMPs and shutting electronics down. And it's one thing to think about this. It's another thing to watch YouTube videos. It's another thing to actually sit there and see what does it take to shut something down. So given that, here's the good news and the bad news. The bad news is that our grid, in this, and not in this country alone, but all around the world, is actually very disjointed.
Oh, yeah.
It's not as cohesive as you would think. And I spent 5 years in Puerto Rico, and I saw how that was one of the worst cases of a grid you can imagine down there, even before the big hurricane. Power was going out all the time. You would see clusters of lines, of power lines running everywhere that were just mind-boggling. And so it was no surprise to me that when the Hurricane Maria hit, especially, that went down. That's an extreme example of what the whole world is like, including our country. So here in Las Vegas, for example, you have these nice, big, strong power lines that can withstand these huge windstorms, and that's because, hey, we have casinos here that make a lot of money by keeping the lights on, so it's worth it to them. You go to many other parts of this country, and they don't have that level of strength. There's a blizzard, and the limbs freeze, and they crack, and they fall on the lines, and they break them. So the bad news is we have a very disjointed power system, but here's the good news. The good news is if there were an EMP, similar to even the Carrington event, which happened in, I believe, 1858, which was a natural EMP that started fires at telegraph